So when we had talked about the Android stack before, I primarily focused on the software layers of the stack. But obviously, when all is said and done, there's also a hardware layer that's kind of at the bottom, right? It's not part of the software stack, but it's a key part to the so-called Android platform. And so what we're going to do here is talk about some of the common hardware elements in Android, the sensors, the transceivers, the storage, and the processors. Those are some of the key hardware elements that are involved. For obvious reasons, hopefully obvious reasons, Android devices are designed to run on a range of hardware elements. That's all part about what a platform provides you. It gives you an ecosystem where you can have people writing lots of cool apps on the top, so you can have millions of apps in the App Store, or how many there are. There's a lot of apps in the App Store. And then you can have a thriving ecosystem of hardware providers who are providing piece parts. And then you have these OEMs, which take different pieces of hardware, take the Android software stack, and then provide that Android platform, and then use some pre-built apps or define their own OEM-centric apps in order to give people a bundled experience. Some of the devices that they have in the hardware are about sensors, which are used to detect events or changes in the environment. And this, of course, is one of the things that makes smartphones so cool, because unlike your laptop, which doesn't really have many sensors in it, if any, maybe it has like a fingerprint sensor or something like that. That's about it. The mobile devices that we have, especially phones, are chock full of interesting sensors. So some sensors are motion sensors that measure acceleration forces and rotation. So things like accelerometers, how fast are you moving? Gyroscopes, where's your position, which you could use for various things like playing games and so on. Those are obviously baked into phones. We did some really cool work about a decade ago as part of a summer research project here, where one of my students created a company that would detect car accidents by measuring rapid deceleration changes in a phone. So you could have basically your personal OnStar system that you could take with you, and it would detect if an accident had occurred. And he founded the company called Split Second, which basically sells Android-based devices. You could plug into things like a lighter, port in your car to detect accidents. Environment sensors measure various properties like temperature, pressure, humidity, and so on. So you have thermometers and barometers if you want your phone to tell you the weather. Not always clear why you would want that, since you can usually use your weather app, but you could use it. There's also position sensors that measure the physical position of a device, like magnometers. So those are examples of sensors. So you can use this for various things. And these are becoming very popular because people want to be able to have kind of one-stop shopping with a device, which you can use to kind of sense the environment. There's also a bunch of things called transceivers, which are basically transmitters and receivers. So the most, maybe one of the most obvious ones, the very ubiquitous one, of course, these days would be Wi-Fi, which gives you a wireless local area network, as long as you've got various beacons around that will speak Wi-Fi to your device. Usually a good way to keep your cell costs down if you can use the Wi-Fi interface, and I think by default, Android sort of prefers Wi-Fi if there's a choice between different communication mechanisms. There's Bluetooth, which is used to, as you probably know, have short personal area communication between, say, you and the speakers in your head, or maybe your laptop or something else. You can use it as a wireless modem, so it's meant for short exchanges. Something called near-field communication, which is really close together. You may remember those somewhat silly commercials a couple years ago about you can bump your phone together and it'll transmit data. Which just seemed to me at least to be a good way to have hackers break into your credit card accounts and stuff like that, but whatever. So I think there's a bunch of wallet-like services that you have that work with near-field communication. And of course, I should also mention you've got the phone, the radio stuff on the phone too. That would be another good example of a transceiver, the radio. Storage, so it's obviously used to retain data. There's a couple of different ways to do this. We'll if we have time, we might talk about some of these things in more detail, but obviously one of the ways of storing data is random access memory, which basically allows you to read and write the data using very efficient means that are about the same speed, sort of regardless of where it lives in the main memory. So usually it's very fast, and of course it's also more expensive, so there's a limited amount. Of course, limited amount is relative. Nowadays it's like 8 gigabytes of limited amount. Back in the early days it was a couple hundred megabytes, so we've got a lot more data than we used to. There's also something called flash memory, and that's the non-volatile memory where if you power off the device, it stays, the information that was stored there still resides, as you probably know, and that memory can be electronically erased and reprogrammed. So unlike, say, traditional laptops or traditional servers, which use spinning disks, which are very cheap but also prone to failure and not that fast, flash memory is faster and has many other properties that work well with things like mobile devices and battery-driven devices. There's also, of course, processors, which are really the things that do the computations and get the work done. As you're probably aware at this point, you've got a bunch of different kinds of processors on a modern smartphone or a modern computer. You've got your classic CPUs that do arithmetic, logical control, and I/O operations. So those are the general purpose devices. You have things like ARM processors or Intel processors or PowerPC processors. Usually mobile devices use some ARM-based processor. Increasingly, these are multi-core. It's pretty much impossible these days to get a single-core CPU anymore. Even on low-end smartphones, they're typically at least dual-core. My phone, which is not the latest and greatest, has quad-core. I think more and more phones have quad-core. They'll probably end up with octo-core processors at some point, although those would tend to eat up a lot of battery power probably. There's also graphics processing units, GPUs, which are specialized processing units that are more efficient for dealing with large blocks of data and running things in parallel. So certain things are done with GPUs, particularly the graphics, so they're more specialized in their capability. And then there's also the digital signal processors, and they're the things that actually are dealing with stuff like the radio interface going analog to digital and vice versa. So they take the analog signals like your voice and turn it into digital signals and send them out or bring them in and turn them back. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of hardware. I guess we do have time for one more section. Obviously, this class is not really talking about the hardware, but it's important to have a good understanding that what's there, because that's really, in some sense, what's really running the show when all is said and done.